Hello again. It's time for the final part of this abortion mini-series that was originally going to be just one video. Part 1 was how we got to this point. Part 2 was how completely insane the pro-choice movement has gotten, and this is the part where the fun really begins. I briefly referenced the fear-mongering in Part 1, but I'm going to focus on particular ones that make the slippery slope fallacy. To be fair, though, there is one slippery slope argument presented here that's not entirely a fallacy, and it's the argument that Obergefell v. Hodges could be next. And for those of you who don't know, that's the Supreme Court ruling that legalized gay marriage nationwide, which is a ruling that came 20 years or so before I ever thought it would be possible. Though I want to make it abundantly clear, I have no problem with gays getting married. Obergefell, while not as egregious as Roe, was still a flawed ruling because the government has zero authority to either legalize or abolish marriages of any kind between consenting adults, gay or straight. There's nothing in the Constitution which authorizes any federal, state, or local agency to grant marriage licenses or prohibit them, as it's really more of a contract issue rather than a licensing issue. Making this a licensing issue essentially turns marriage into a government entitlement, which places government firmly in your own personal affairs, yet instead of realizing this, the left has instead opted to expand this entitlement instead of questioning its existence, which would be the more constitutionally appropriate approach. But while we're still on the subject of marriage, let's talk about the first slippery slope fallacy, being that interracial marriage might be targeted because the Loving v. Virginia case supposedly might be eventually overturned. Now, even in the unlikely event that Loving v. Virginia is overturned, all 50 states are going to legalize it practically overnight. While racism still exists in America, the vast majority of racism is actually on the far left with its paternalism, and actual white supremacy has been on life support in America since the 90s, thanks in large part to Generation X, which was starting to really have an influence politically at that time. Much like millennials like yours truly were starting to in the early 2010s, really, they didn't give a crap about skin color. Matter of fact, interracial marriages become more common than ever, with certain demographics like Latinos and Asians in particular having rates in their communities in some areas as high as 40%. Even most conservatives really just don't care. Justice Clarence Thomas is married to a white woman. I can think of a few examples in my own family as well. I have two cousins that are mixed white and Vietnamese ancestry, and a few more cousins in Hawaii that are mixed white and Hawaiian ancestry, and in both cases their parents tended to vote Republican. In the case of the Hawaiians, the kids do too. Much to my own annoyance, there are a lot of Republicans that are afraid to get in there and fight the race baiting that's going on the left because they're afraid of being called racists, with some of them actually being complicit, particularly the uniparty swamp monsters like Lynn Cheney and Anna Kinzinger, by essentially joining in on this. Of course, that's a subject for another video, and it's looking like Lynn Cheney's getting primaried, and I hope Adam Kinzinger follows suit with that. That should be interesting to see. Culture is often more important than law because it's culture that informs politics, which informs law. There is and was a cultural push to ban abortion, but there's no longer any major cultural push to ban or restrict interracial marriage because we've gotten to the point as a society where the majority of the population, and not a small majority, a very large one, see little if any distinction between an interracial marriage and a non-interracial marriage. And again, this isn't just a slight majority. The likelihood of this reversing within our lifetimes is practically impossible. You can count the number of people that believe in white replacement theory on one hand, contrary to what the media wants you to think. Another slippery slope fallacy is that it could lead to the overturning of Griswold v. Connecticut, which was a Supreme Court case that overturned a Connecticut law that outlawed its citizens, primarily married couples, from acts using contraceptives, and was used as precedent in the Roe v. Wade ruling. This ruling was, again, narrow, applied only to married couples, but was expanded with the N. Stott v. Baird ruling. which was made the same year as the Roe versus Wade ruling. Now, this is another case where the culture simply won't allow for such a thing, even if said ruling goes through. According to a poll, that's a tad old, but probably still accurate. My apologies for not being able to find one that's more current, but anyway, linked in the description. 87% of Republicans view birth control as morally permissible compared to 90% of Democrats, which is really not that big of a difference, partisan-wise. But the only real partisan division on birth control question is in regards to whether or not employers such as Hobby Lobby or taxpayers should be forced to pay for birth control. And I know this is a difficult concept for many of you to understand, but not forcing someone to pay for something you want is not the same thing as outlawing it from you having it in the first place. You are never under any circumstances entitled to the fruits of someone else's labor. And just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean you have the right to force someone to take part in it. For the record, if I owned a major company that offered a health insurance plan to my employees, I probably would offer birth control as part of the package because I want to see fewer abortions, and I think birth control does help in that regard. Now, you can criticize these people all you want, and I'll gladly join you, but I won't join you in using government violence to compel them to fund things that go against their personal beliefs, even as hypocritical as I may find some of them. Neither the taxpayers nor your employer is your baby daddy, and I find it rather creepy that so many of you are trying to make taxpayers and your employers your baby daddy. I understand there are people that are struggling, but there would be far fewer people struggling if the government wasn't trying to micromanage the entire economy to appease the alarming number of economically illiterate voters. And speaking of economically illiterate people, I even found one article linked in the description, of course, that argued that something completely unrelated to the culture wars, the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, could also be in danger of being overturned because of, the potential of Roe being overturned. And I sincerely hope this is the case because in addition to being economically destructive by increasing the cost of health care while reducing the quality, it also blatantly violates the Interstate Commerce Clause by giving government power to force people to buy a product or service, and violates the 10th Amendment by having the federal government do something that falls outside of its enumerated powers and thus falls entirely within the purview of the states. Now, this article doesn't argue that this would be overturned due to precedents in Roe would create, but merely that a conservative court would be likely to do so due to its ideological leanings, in which I say, I wish I was as confident about that assertion as this author is. In many cases, conservatives appear to be leftists driving the speed limit. Now, I haven't seen any serious efforts to overturn Obamacare in years, but the last one was proposed by Trump in 2017. It was really more of a tweak to the ineffective system rather than replacing it as should have been done. But back to the topic at hand, at least slightly less slippery but still somewhat slippery slope fallacies about in vitro fertilization due to how unused embryos end up getting destroyed. Now, I could see more regulations coming to address that issue and perhaps more difficulty in getting those services until this can be figured out, but I just don't see pro-lifers chomping at the bits to get rid of this. Now, granted, the author of this article states that this will be unintentional consequences, therefore, but still, this still comes off as fear-mongering. Now, I know some of you are rolling your eyes and saying, oh, this is ridiculous, and that was my reaction when I first heard these arguments, and still is, but we're not done yet, because we have to talk about where they got this information from, how they got to this kind of logic. So we're going to counter this BS. We have to understand where they're coming from, even if it is absolute nonsense. Now, Roe versus Wade, Griswold versus Connecticut, and Loving versus Virginia are all tied to the court's interpretation of privacy rights, as well as leftist interpretations of the claim by Justice Alito that abortion, quote, the inescapable conclusion is that the right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions, which is kind of half true and kind of half false. I mean, abortion was actually legal until the second trimester or quickening when the woman was able to feel her baby moving, until a push for criminalization of abortion began to occur in the early 19th century and reached its peak in the late 19th century, with doctors being the main drivers behind this push thanks to advances in medical technology, improving our understanding of embryology, combined with changes in culture at that time. But he wasn't entirely wrong either, since before Roe, there really wasn't many federal laws on the federal level regarding this. So, yeah, federally speaking, it wasn't part of the American legal tradition. On the state level, yeah. Now, they are correct that precedent plays a profound role in court rulings. Again, that can sometimes come with unintended consequences, but precedent, good or bad, is actually getting overturned far more often than it did before, which is in large part a function of our politically polarized society and the fact that culture changes much faster and in more radical directions than it used to. Before Roe, abortion was controversial, but far less so. And possible that it could be the case, at least in the long run, the likely event Roe gets overturned. But it seems the short-term consequences are going to be further polarization, with journalist Tim Pool going so far as to argue it could be a contributing factor in a second American Civil War. And nobody can predict with 100% accuracy every single ramification behind this. We can say that most of the doomsday predictions are rather unlikely at best. With that said, this is going to be enough abortion videos for me for at least a little while, as I have plenty of other subjects to cover, and until then, I'll see you in a bit.